Okay, why don't we get started? Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for joining us for this very important program. I'm Richard Kravitz, Director of UC Center Sacramento, and it's a pleasure to welcome you here to Capital Insights, which, as some of you may know and some of you may not, is a quarterly program that we align with current, timely, and topical issues affecting the state of California. Also, just a word about our center for those of you who may not be fully familiar with us. We're a system-wide program of the University of California with two missions: to prepare California's future leaders through experiential learning and to share knowledge in the interest of better public policy making. So why did we assemble this specific program on vehicle miles traveled? Well, first, what California does with climate change, even in this fraught federal environment, is really important, both because of California's size, the 7th or 8th largest economy in the world, and because the state is a role model for other parts of the country and for the world. California has among the strictest laws on emissions and miles per gallon, but this is potentially all for naught if all of us just drive more. And my understanding is that the most recent data are that vehicle miles traveled are actually going up. So at the same time, the transportation landscape in the state and in the country has been changing quickly. Anyone who has 20-something kids living at home will know that characteristic thump on the front doorstep is often an Amazon package delivered once or twice per day. When you multiply that by the number of people in the state or the country, it's a lot of thumps, and it's a lot of Amazon driving, other kinds of delivery driving. We also have transportation companies like Uber that we'll be hearing from, and even looking towards the future, self-driving cars. So there's a lot of ways in which the landscape will be changing. So it's important to understand where we are and what California can do to address the issues of vehicle miles traveled, both now and in the future. So with that in mind, it's a pleasure to introduce our three speakers today. First, we'll be hearing from Elliot Martin. He's a research and development engineer at UC Berkeley, where he also earned his PhD. He's affiliated with the Berkeley Transportation Sustainability Research Center, and he studies how travel behavior affects system impacts. So he's really perfectly suited to lead us off this afternoon. He'll be followed by Jennifer Gress, who's Chief of Sustainable Transportation and Communities Division at the California Air Resources Board. She has a PhD in social ecology from UC Irvine, and previously she served as advisor to Mayor Dale Steinberg, as legislative director for the California Air Resources Board, and as consultant to the State Transportation and Housing Committee. And finally, it's our pleasure to bring to the podium Austin Hayworth. He's a senior manager of public policy in California for Uber. He has degrees from UC Davis in both economics and political science. And in a prior life, he worked as special assistant to Assembly Speaker John Perez and for Assembly member Jackie Irwin. So without any further ado, I think we'll bring Elliot Martin to the podium. Thank you.
Thank you very much for having me. And so the title of our talk is Vehicle Miles Traveled and with New Mobility Systems in E-Commerce. And so what I'll be speaking to today is providing a little bit of context for what VMT is doing and what we're seeing in terms of trends in driving, and then also in energy consumption, coupled with that with VMT per capita, and put that in context with some of the new mobility systems that are out there that can be that are emerging that can potentially change this, and how we would actually look to see and measure that change in VMT. And then I'll also talk a little bit more about some types of projects that exist that may enable better coordination between new mobility systems and our traditional public transit systems, and speak a little bit also about sort of trends we see in e-commerce. So vehicle miles traveled, of course, is a metric of major focus in transportation policy, and we're interested in this metric because it's strongly correlated with public costs that we care about, including energy, emissions, safety, and congestion. And new mobility systems really can impact VMT by enabling changes in behavior and vehicle ownership. And these are two key components. First of all, we do see, of course, mode shift that does occur as a result of new mobility systems active in our urban and suburban and rural environments. But we also see these systems potentially being able to change the number of vehicles people own. And if you change personal vehicle ownership, that can have dramatic effects on overall VMT and also, of course, behavior. This is a trend I like to lead off with in vehicle miles traveled. It's national vehicle miles traveled. So this is the trend from the FHWA TVT reports put together. And indeed, as mentioned by Richard earlier, we are indeed at an all-time high for VMT. A couple things to note about this trend is that of course, it's going back to 1971, so it's pretty long in terms of its continuity. And it's measured in the same way, throughout continuously. It's measured by sensor counts. So it's measured by a sort of a combination of data from the HPMS system and then also sensor counts that are collected. And it's routinely updated. So it's a 12-month look back. It basically sums up the overall counts, it takes data from the sensors, and then it basically adjusts what it sees as far as VMT is concerned over time. And so this series is constantly getting updated for, going back 2 to 3 years. But we do see that the trend is pretty continuous, and it's been continuous upward for much of the late last 20th century. So of course, you can just draw a line through and you can see that if you made a prediction of what VMT was going to be in 1990 for what VMT was going to be in about 10 years, you'd be spot on if you just drew a line from what you saw in the 1980s. But then, in the early 20th century, 21st century, we've seen sort of this change in trend. That peak that you've observed there is it's predating the Great Recession a little bit, and of course we had this decline in VMT that did occur. And that stagnation, that flattening of VMT did occur basically during much of the economic recovery following the Great Recession. And it is the longest stagnation we've ever observed in this entire time series. And this goes back further than 1971. It goes back pretty much all the way back before World War I. Of course, the measurement methods were different back then. But since then, it has started to rise again, and we are at now measuring, based on this continuous series, sort of an all-time high of VMT. But the line does show that we have sort of changed our trajectory of growth in VMT. And so when we think about sort of how new mobility systems change overall vehicle miles traveled, we do have to consider not only what are we seeing on the roads, but also what would we have seen in the absence of these systems. Now, this isn't all due to new mobility systems. That's not the point here. It's due to a combination of everything that's going on, including increased telecommuting, including changes in other sort of residential patterns and such. And of course, it is still moving up. When we think about or look at what vehicle miles traveled is doing on a per capita basis, and this is again in the context of the United States, not in California, we do see that we had a decline during the Great Recession. We had a continued decline as population continues to grow, and now it's gone back up again, but it's still not at the peak as to what it was measured previously. So there has been sort of a flattening in the key trends of sort of how much driving that we're doing. We're still driving a lot, there's no doubt about that, but there are some changes in our overall trajectory that have at least been ongoing recently. So it's important for us to remember that aggregate VMT measurement is actually difficult. Today, VMT measurement is really done by proxy. So we talk a lot about this measurement, but it's done using road sensors. It's done using fuel consumption, regional modeling, and sort of other methods. There's no direct measurement. So we have, of course, the vehicles themselves measuring exactly how much they're driving, but leveraging that information is very difficult. So localized VMT measurement, the kind that would allow us to monitor sort of overall progress within urban, suburban, and rural environments is very, very challenging to do. And we still have sort of a ways to go in terms of defining sort of appropriate measurements that might exist that would be useful for evaluating how certain new mobility systems, when scaled at a regional level, would be might be impacting what's going on overall in aggregate. It's important also to tie this to energy because we do care about VMT primarily because of energy. That's a key thing, and you can see that the trends in oil consumption within the United States are also quite high. We did have this dip with the Great Recession, the flatlining, and now, of course, we are approaching a peak again. One thing that's really evident within this graph, as we show the blue line, is our overall domestic oil production, and then the green line is really on the secondary axis on the right, shows sort of our percentage of foreign oil imports. So this is sort of a case where the narrative, the concerns about sort of foreign oil dependence in a very, very short time, in the course of a decade, were a long concern for this country, but they've effectively gone to zero. Now, of course, it's at the expense of the enhanced oil recovery that we're doing domestically, but it does show how certain trends can really change. And when we also look at the grid emissions and what we've seen with respect to just within California, we can also see a very, very rapid change that is occurring quite quickly. You can see here, this is a plot of the estimated CO2 emissions from the California electric grid. And this is just over the course of the last few years, from 2014 to 2019. Every year, our emissions and the emissions from our electrical grid is declining. And one of the most stark declines is that in May of this year, the emissions from the electrical grid were 50% what they were just back in 2014. This is due to the rapid expansion, primarily of solar, but of course all renewable energy sources are really coming online, and so it only increases really the motivation for seeing if a lot of the VMT that we're looking at can be electrified, because that is the grid is basically getting cleaner every single year. And that's a good thing with respect to trying to find ways in which we can leverage that to clean up sort of the negative consequences of VMT with respect to emissions. So there are a variety of new mobility systems today that have, and some of them have been around for a long time. Car sharing is sort of the primary new mobility system that existed since in North America since 1994. It came into the U.S. in 1998, and it existed pretty much by itself in terms of the world of shared mobility for about 10 years, and expanded across the country in the form of round-trip car sharing. And it has since evolved into P2P car sharing and one-way car sharing, and has grown across the country. And these are fixed asset systems. So most car sharing systems do really rely on sort of a fleet system where people can access a vehicle, use it temporarily, and then deposit that vehicle either within a zone or back in the parking space in which it was first accessed. And the advantage of this, of course, is that it reduces vehicle ownership for a minority of the population that is using it. So some people can really use this to substitute the acquisition of a personal vehicle. That has some dramatic effects. And then this evolved into bike sharing and TNCs and microtransit, micromobility, which is, I think, potentially considered a evolution of bike sharing itself. That's sort of dockless scooters, dockless bikes, e-bikes. And then lest we forget public transit, which really plays a major role in terms of the backbone of mobility services, and one that we would like to have all of these systems effectively support on sort of high-flow arterials. So how will new mobility systems change VMT? Well, travel behavior changes in public transit, walking, and bicycling, other shared active modes, and personal driving. So there is that direct mode substitution that we do want to measure. We want to be aware of what that substitution is when we substitute off of public transit, when we substitute towards public transit, walking, biking, and even personal vehicle driving, people using personal vehicles, their own personal vehicle less, perhaps in the substitution of other modes, such as microtransit or TNCs. There also is changes in vehicle ownership, and this is measured in two ways, and I'll talk a little bit more about this, but it's measured in the form of, first of all, vehicle shedding. So vehicle shedding is the reduction of vehicles. You don't need a vehicle anymore, it's too expensive to hold, you have other ways of getting around, so you get rid of a vehicle. There's also what we call personal vehicle suppression, and that is the act of not buying a vehicle, not acquiring one, that you would have otherwise acquired. And if you don't acquire a vehicle, then you don't drive that vehicle. And that has actually some very, very powerful effects that I'll speak to in a moment. There's also changes in fuel type. Of course, there's changes in efficiency. Generally, these shared mobility systems are using vehicles that are more efficient than the average fleet, and they're becoming increasingly electrified. So those are important aspects too, where we may be measuring VMT and seeing VMT, but the sort of public costs and energy consumption or emissions that are associated with them are different. That has become sort of an emerging component of impact. There also is system vehicle activity. We don't want to forget, particularly in light of activities from TNCs and then also microtransit. or these systems go to people and pick them up, and there is that system activity that we do want to measure. How much is that overhead of VMT occurring with respect to sort of just the circulating and then also the fetching of the passengers? And finally, system logistical operations. This mostly applies to the things like dockless bike sharing systems, or even actually all bike sharing systems. There is a movement and a rebalancing of these vehicles around that does make a difference with respect and does add to the energy consumption of these systems that needs to be considered when we're looking at net effects. So there is evidence from sort of analyses that we've done with one-way car sharing that people do get rid of vehicles as a result of these systems. And when we ask these questions, we ask them very directly, did you get rid of it? And is it because of that system? Not just did you get rid of a vehicle while you were using it, but was it because of this system? That attribution is very, very important. And we found that 2 to 5% of vehicles sold across 5 cities were sold due to car sharing. And we found that the suppression rate was a little bit higher. 7 to 10% respondents did not get or not acquire a vehicle due to car-to-go, and in this particular case. So that's a very important component, and suppression is just easier to do relative to shedding. It is the not taking an action of putting capital outlay to purchase a vehicle. And you can translate these effects into sort of overall percentage reductions in VMT by households across cities. You can look at what the population was doing beforehand, you can look at what the population was doing after, and you can get sort of a measurement of those impacts. When we look at micromobility and VMT as well, we do see that such travelers may reduce their VMT through mode substitution, but the trips that they're substituting are relatively short. And that's also an important consideration. When we look at what those trips are, only a subset of them will be substituting for personal vehicle miles traveled, so within sort of a taxi, perhaps a TNC, or perhaps their own personal vehicle. And that's really where the emissions savings is. EV-based systems, of course, require energy input for charging, and vehicle activities facilitate vehicle charging and redistribution. And so all of those are energy inputs. Micromobility may be one of those systems where we see a decline in VMT, at least the VMT that we're most concerned about in four-wheeled vehicles, yet we see an increase in energy due to all of the logistical operations. And at the same time, we see a decline in emissions if we keep making progress with respect to the electrical grid, and yet transfer that energy to electrical energy. So there's sort of an interesting dynamic with respect to this type of system that we first of all need to see higher substitution, maybe on the order of 10 to 15%, in order to balance out the energy inputs that these systems require. There also are travel behavior components that we do want to measure. This is sort of a chart showing sort of the components of travel behavior change that we would want to measure when we look at sort of TNCs. So there's 4 main components. We're really interested in changes in personal vehicle miles traveled, with the substitution of PVMT and with TNC, sort of personal vehicle miles with TNC activity. So we don't want to just count, when we're looking at sort of a net measurement, we don't want to just count what's going on with respect to we don't want to just count VMT because it's in a TNC vehicle. We do want to understand sort of, is that substituting for a vehicle that would have been driven anyway? That's a very important component to consider in terms of measurement. We also do want to understand personal vehicle shedding. Does this happen as a result of TNCs? And we do think it does. And primarily because we have personal vehicle shedding in the form of shared mobility, bringing that access to mobility to the user. So unlike car sharing where you have fixed access and you have to get to the asset comes to you. And that works for some people where car sharing really wouldn't. There is also, of course, this component by the same dynamic of personal vehicle suppression. That's also very, very important in terms of what personal vehicle ownership is being avoided due to TNCs. And then finally, the change in use of other shared modes, and this, of course, is this substitution of car sharing, it's a substitution of taxis. We don't want to just, if somebody was going to take a trip to an airport in a taxi, and now they take it in a TNC, we don't want to just count that VMT against TNCs just because it happens to be in a TNC and it's much more easily measurable. We do want to sort of consider the fact that VMT would have occurred anyway. So when looking at the net effects, we do want to make sure that we're considering all of these dynamics when we do look at sort of what are these systems by themselves doing on the road. But of course, there is the change in components that do exist with respect to what the TNCs are doing. They're broken out into 4 periods. We consider period 0, which is travel to the passenger market. A subset of TNC drivers are known to do this, drive some distance. This isn't necessarily measured by the TNCs itself, but it does occur. It's maybe before they turn on the app. So there's no registration of this mileage really being on a formal system, there's no measurement of these miles anywhere, but they are occurring and they are due to the activities of TNCs. And then of course there's period 1, open to passengers, period 2, the fetching and the access of passengers, and period 3, where the vehicle is with at least 1 passenger. There's also, in terms of measurement, the important issue of double counting that we need to consider, which really only occurs in period 1, where a vehicle may be open to passengers, but may also be looking for passengers on 2 apps. This is also known to happen. And how often does this happen? Taking into account that measurement, because these miles will be registered in both systems. So if we take all that data and we put it into 2 systems and we add them up, we will be overcounting the amount of miles that are there. There's also an important component of new mobility systems integration with public transit. And there are examples of systems that complement public transit through natural activities. So we do know that these systems are used to access an egress public transit with no policy intervention at all. But there also are cases where there's coordination of these systems. And I'll just give an example of a few of them that do exist. Some of them are with microtransit. So this is an example of one project that is funded by the FTA Mod Sandbox program, where zones are established and microtransit systems can circulate, and you can basically look up these microtransit systems and get a ride anywhere from the transit station to the zone. And the pricing depends on where you're going and also sort of whether you're in or outside the zone. So a lot of the coordination that does occur in this particular project and in others is really zonal based. You can move from point to point within inside of a zone, and it works very much in terms of a way of just picking you up near where you are, and dropping you off near where you want to go, and then you do the last mile by foot. Closer to where we are, there's VIA in West Sacramento, which is also operating a system just zone point to point within the West Sacramento region that you can use also to access transit services within that environment. And then there's also another program called Go Dublin, which is just within the city of Dublin. And again, it's point to point using a TNC. You can hail any TNC or taxi, and using the promotional code, get anywhere within Dublin for a reduced and flat fare. And what's notable about this particular program is that this was done actually in substitution of a particular bus line that was it was very, very low ridership. And so one of the motivations for designing this particular system was that it was to save energy or save cost as well, because the bus line that was serving a very, very low density area wasn't really having enough ridership yet. Of course, it had to run through the line, run through the area very, very frequently. But it just wasn't useful enough. And so TNCs, in this case, could really service that mobility far more effectively. And so then this program sort of came about and is still in operation. There's also, I'll just speak with e-commerce and VMT. E-commerce, of course, has been growing significantly since the start of the century, and it results in an increase in number of packages. As mentioned, that thump sound that occurs on the doorstep is, in fact, a package being delivered, and it increases the number of shipping vehicles and the miles traveled by them. We've all seen these in form of all delivery services that we're aware that are visible, including Amazon's own delivery system. And so, there are questions that we have to ask about what is this doing to VMT? And we can first of all look at a little bit with respect to the trends in e-commerce. What is e-commerce doing in terms of the size of economy? Well, of overall commerce. This is an example of sort of retail sales. And a plot of retail sales over time and a plot of e-commerce using the sort of quarterly e-commerce reports. And so you can see that e-commerce is now about over 10% of overall retail sales. That's a lot. That's a very significant component of retail sales. And the top green line is overall total retail sales, and then the blue line right below it is the retail sales with that e-commerce taken out. So you can kind of see the relative difference and the relative reduction in sort of bricks and mortar retail sales that are occurring, taken out by e-commerce. You can notice that this is growing during that period. I mean, you can see the Great Recession, but this is growing during that period of VMT stagnation. So e-commerce has been growing continuously, despite the fact that we've seen other times where we've had declines in VMT, and we've also had just sort of flattening of VMT. And when we look at sort of trends in taxable diesel fuel, we can see that this trend has moved up a little bit, but it hasn't moved up so significantly. And given the rapid rise of e-commerce that has occurred during the same period, I'm not sure that we're necessarily going to see what that, sort of an increase in overall VMT as a result. We have to think about that substitution that might occur with respect to all people going to sort of retail locations and picking up the products that they want with respect to and substitute that with a vehicle that's conducting a tour around and delivering those packages. All of those trips are, of course, eliminated. So there's a push and pull with respect to the impact of e-commerce, but in terms of aggregate trends, these are big trends. We don't see movement necessarily in large trends that would sort of point to say, that's because definitely it's due to the increase in e-commerce. So just some concluding remarks. New mobility and freight systems undoubtedly exhibit impacts on VMT. The measurement of VMT and impacts on specific systems is, in particular over time, is challenging. We can get these snapshot views of what's going on with respect to VMT, but very, very difficult to measure them over time given current data collection systems. And the impacts of assessment need to not only consider the VMT that we see, but we also want to be very careful to understand the VMT that we don't see. So what would have happened in the absence of this system? That's a very, very important measure to make sure that we're keeping track of as we really sort of zone in on one particular system and look at it. And new methods of local and regional VMT measure would help advance also understanding how large system impacts our local sort of environments on an aggregate scale. So thank you very much, and I'll take any questions.
Good afternoon. All right, it's a pleasure to be here today. I'm Jennifer Gress. I'm with the California Air Resources Board, and I'm really happy to be talking about VMT reduction. This is a concept that we have been talking about for at least 5 decades. It's always sprinkled in here or there, and it hasn't yet gotten the policy attention that I think it deserves. So I'm always looking for opportunities like this one to talk more about the need to reduce VMT and some potential strategies that we can employ to do so. Okay, so today the transportation sector, when accounting for emissions from fuel production and delivery, represent over half of the greenhouse gas emissions in California. And while California has hit its 2020 climate target about 4 years ahead of schedule, that has been primarily due to strong performance in the energy sector. Emissions from transportation continue to rise despite increases in fuel efficiency and decreases in the carbon content of fuel. And we will not achieve the necessary emission reductions to achieve our climate or air quality goals by 2030 and beyond without greater contributions from the transportation sector. And zero-emission vehicles, I am here to tell you, those alone are not going to be sufficient to meet these goals in the near term. Okay, so how are we doing on VMT reduction? Well, as you just heard, we are not doing very well. Despite a landmark bill, SB 375, which links regional transportation and land use planning in order to reduce VMT and assist in meeting the state's climate goals, the data show that VMT, in fact, are increasing. This chart shows that to achieve SB 375's 2035 GHG target, we need to reduce VMT by approximately 25% from 2005 levels, as shown in the rightmost green dot. This is the equivalent of reducing 4.7 miles per person from what people are currently averaging. However, the trends in CO2 emissions per capita and VMT are up through 2016, as shown by the orange and blue lines, respectively. And it's not just that we are not on track, we are moving in the wrong direction. So to achieve VMT reductions, we need a holistic approach. We need to have better land use planning that puts housing closer to jobs and key destinations. We need increased investments in alternatives to driving alone and creative partnerships that create options. And we need pricing strategies. Okay, so let's start with housing, because how we build communities matters. The data show that housing construction and permitting are significantly behind needs. The jobs housing imbalances are increasing in many regions in the state, and housing cost burdens have increased statewide, as shown in this chart. And housing cost burden isn't just increasing, it's expanding across more income groups. It's affecting more and more households than ever before. And this lack of affordable housing is a problem for the climate and for public health. As people move further away from their jobs or their families, they drive more and emissions go up. So solving our transportation challenges requires taking action on the housing crisis. The governor has made clear his priorities for further action in this area. We probably have all read the headlines that we need to build a generation's worth of housing in a very short period of time, but we can't just build this housing anywhere. Where these homes are built and who can afford them will shape people's daily lives, our communities, and travel patterns for the next century. Putting housing closer to jobs and other key destinations offers an opportunity to begin addressing a range of important quality of life and social equity issues concerning mobility, public health, access to opportunity, and economic prosperity. We need to think about how we can strengthen local and regional planning. In California, that could include amending the 375 law to extend target horizons to 2040 or 2050. We can increase accountability and enforceability, or include additional targets for other resource areas that impact VMT, like housing or land conservation and equity. State policies that influence the regulation of local land use may also be helpful, and there are a few examples that folks can talk about: establishing minimum densities for new development to increase density and reduce the rate of sprawl and thus VMT, parking maximums on new development to discourage personal car ownership, as well as reduce the cost of building new housing, incentives or requirements to change local land use requirements in a way that actually support regional sustainable community strategies, and incentives or regulations to push new development in low VMT areas. So we also need to be investing in options to the personal vehicle. We need to be making investments that create convenient and affordable alternatives. In California's 4 largest regions, you see here the Bay Area, Sacramento, San Diego, and Southern California, you can see that the proportion of overall transportation spending planned by mode has remained nearly the same since the enactment of SB 375 nearly a decade ago. And the portion of people driving alone to work rose or stayed the same in most regions. So a key part of strengthening our planning and implementation is to make sure that VMT reduction is an explicit goal in state funding programs, and we can do this by revising funding guidelines and adding new project selection criteria around VMT reduction. There are several programs that are already doing this. This isn't a radically new idea. The Cap and Trade Auction Proceeds funds a few programs. For example, the Transit Intercity Rail Program, the Low Carbon Transit Operations Program. Both of those programs fund transit. And the Affordable Housing and Sustainable Communities Program, along with the Transformative Climate Communities Program, invest in housing and other developments in infill neighborhoods that bring residents closer to work and school and other key destinations. And they fund projects that help support mode shifts like bike share and active transportation infrastructure, transit subsidies. So there's some good programs out there. But there are other opportunities that exist, and that's really what part of the take-home here for you all is SB1 is a good opportunity. Also, state and federal funding that Caltrans and regional transportation agencies administer. Regional transportation plans contain funding for over $1 trillion in transportation capital operations and maintenance projects over the next few decades. Okay. Again, we got to create options for people. And we saw some examples here in the last presentation. It's really important to promote pilot projects that bring together innovators, technical experts, community residents, public agencies to find creative solutions and new partnerships to accelerate change, creating new mobility options and improving access to opportunity, particularly for low-income communities. An example is a pilot program administered by CARB, and we call it the Clean Mobility Options for Disadvantaged Communities. This pilot consists of projects designed to address the barriers to clean mobility in low-income communities, and we provide funding for zero-emission or plug-in hybrid car sharing, van pools, bike share, ride-hailing, and other clean mobility options that communities want to try out. You heard about some examples in the previous presentation. There's an example right here in Sacramento, the Our Community Car Share program that provides free electric car sharing in 4 different low-income housing developments funded through that program. Okay. The last type of strategy I'm going to talk about is pricing. It's often controversial, but it's got to be an important part of this conversation. Pricing strategies can help reflect the true cost of driving. They can discourage driving alone. They create incentives for pooling and the use of ZEVs. And they generate revenue that can be reinvested in alternative and affordable modes to driving in a single occupant car. Obviously, a key challenge here, and we all need to recognize this, is structuring these pricing efforts to avoid undue harm to low-income and disadvantaged community residents, as those folks often can't change their work hours and have limited ability to find new options. But with that in mind, some examples could include a road user charge or a mileage-based fee to help reflect more accurately the true cost of driving, zero emission or congestion zones that require fee for entry, and you could add discounts for ZEVs or for pooling, conversion of existing lanes to high occupancy toll lanes that will discourage driving alone and can be used to incentivize ZEVs or pooling. Fee bait, that's often a very popular idea for light-duty vehicles to discourage the purchase of internal combustion engine vehicles and instead and generate revenue for incentive programs for cleaner vehicles or other mobility options. And then parking pricing policies are a really important tool to help spur behavior change. Okay, the Clean Mile Standard. We cannot forget that we need to think about new mobility, and I'm sandwiched in between Elliot and Ed. He talked a lot about new mobility in Austin from Uber. And one of the new regs that we are developing is the Clean Mile Standard. This is coming through a bill, SB 1014, by Senator Skinner, and it requires CARB and the California Public Utilities Commission to adopt and implement a program to reduce greenhouse gas emissions from passenger TNCs like Uber and Lyft. So with the passage of this bill, we are currently tasked with establishing a base year emissions inventory for 2018. We just held a workshop a few weeks ago to take public comment on our draft inventory. And following this, we will be adopting a CO2 targets for TNCs and compliance mechanisms for the TNCs. The targets will be based on grams of CO2 per passenger mile. They'll be effective starting in January 2023, and the TNCs are required to develop implementation plans starting in 2022 and submitting those every 2 years thereafter. So we're starting, now that we've done the inventory and have a good sense of what's happening out there, we're starting to think about the different compliance mechanisms. And so as we develop this regulation, we've put forth a number of principles that we're keeping in mind as we figure out how we're going to structure the regulation. So some of these principles are, number one, to increase zero-emission miles in TNCs by encouraging them to utilize zero-emission vehicles in their operations. A second principle is to increase pooling, connections to transit, and connections to active transport modes, such as bike and scooter share services. A third principle is that we have to make sure this regulation applies to automated vehicles, not just vehicles with drivers. And we want to keep in mind other programs and policy objectives and make sure that other state objectives and other programs are complementary to what we're doing in the Clean Mile Standard, so that all of our programs are working together towards the same goals. Equity is a key consideration for us. We will be exploring how our reg design and incentives can promote access to transportation opportunities. And finally, this will be a data-driven process, and we'll be looking at promoting ZEV infrastructure for TNCs, as well as maximizing benefits to low and moderate income drivers. So we're starting to see examples of these VMT reducing strategies throughout the state. And I talked about some of these here. You heard about a few in the previous presentation. I'm sure Austin will talk about some things they're doing. But to achieve our air quality and climate goals and just quality of life, we need to dramatically accelerate the pace and scale of these efforts. And it's tough work because we are talking about how we design communities and doing that differently. We're talking about changing our travel patterns, and the changes that we make today will take a long time to realize the types of benefits that we really need to see. So we need to double down now. We don't have time to wait on these policies. We have to start implementing them now so that we can actually see progress in the next generation. And there is some great hope. I'm so pleased to see Governor Newsom's recent executive order specifically on VMT reduction. In that executive order, he directs state agencies, and specifically CALSTA, the California State Transportation Agency, to leverage over $5 billion in state funding for transportation to lower vehicle miles traveled and to reduce the state's carbon footprint with regard to transportation. So it's really important progress. So I think, with the governor's leadership and, of course, with the legislature's leadership in this area as well, I think we have an opportunity here to turn the tide. And with that, I'll be happy to take any questions.
Good afternoon, everybody. Thank you to the UC Center for having me. I'm the only panelist without a doctorate, but I am a proud UC grad. And I am glad or sort of fortunate to be going last because a lot of the themes that were touched on and framed, I think, very well, I'll be able to speak to from a little bit of a business or operational perspective about how we see that kind of coming to life and how we structure a business around that thinking. I'll never forget my first year in this job, I was speaking to Jen Gress when she was at the city about growth in VMT and what the city was interested in doing about it. And I said, well, Jen, growth in VMT isn't necessarily a bad thing because not all VMT is created equal. And there was complete crickets on the other side of the phone. So I'll take this as an opportunity to explain what I meant, I guess. So Uber, if you're not familiar with it, is it's big now. It's in a lot of places all around the world. We serve roughly 600 cities as we define it in 65 countries, and that's a little bit of an outdated number. We've done over 13 or 14 billion trips now. And, no surprise that the way that the business operates in a place like California is very different than in India. So the way we think about VMT and some of these trends are really interesting because we see how it actually translates into different cultures and also very, very, very different mobility markets where affordability of a personal vehicle looks a whole lot different than it may in California. So it's interesting when I speak to international colleagues about these concepts where this is not as much of a public sector concept, but when we can bring this to the table, oftentimes it's the first time it's ever being spoken about in some markets, like in South America, for example. But it's also a huge user base. So a lot of the themes I'll speak to are also about the fact that the little changes that happen on a platform like ours can impact a lot of people really quickly, and a lot of people can get exposed to it. We now have about 4.2 million drivers around the world that use Uber for work. It's actually the largest provider of work opportunity in the world now. So the scale is really interesting when we think about making these changes. It not only percolates in a lot of different countries, but a lot of different people experience it in the first way through a platform like Uber. So high level message here is I think Uber has grown to a point where we view ourselves as a mobility platform, not just a ride-sharing service as you would have seen it 5 years ago. And so really it calls into question a lot of serious questions about if we're going to be allowed to continue to grow at the pace we're growing, we really need to understand how we can be a net contributor to cities. And that's, again, as I mentioned before, it means a lot of different things in different places, but it's understanding the unique mobility needs of a given city and adapting to that and finding ways to supplement, the existing infrastructure that's there and solve real problems for moving people more efficiently. And while, there's obviously tons of different varying opinions about ride sharing and its impact in terms of sustainability and congestion in the world, I'm going to demonize the personal vehicle because that really is the ultimate evil. There's nothing worse for all these things than driving yourself around. For the vast majority of people, getting around means purchasing, insuring, storing, and paying for the operation of your own personal vehicle. About 80% of trips for everybody in the United States includes you sitting in the driver's seat with nobody else in the car. So it's a lot of empty seats. So the business proposition of ride sharing is let's fill up those seats and make more efficient use of the vehicles that we already have. But it's also, as Jen was mentioning, we understand that we have a role in addressing the housing issues that California faces. Because for every vehicle in California, there's a lot. I don't remember what the most recent registration numbers are, but there's more than people. And for every vehicle, there's about 3.5 to 8 parking spots built for every single one of those vehicles, depending on what city you live in. So that's a lot of wasted space that could be turned into affordable housing. And I forgot the term that was used by Dr. Martin about vehicle shedding, but the idea of making your life more livable without owning your own vehicle changes where you live, right? Living in downtown San Francisco is more realistic than it's ever been because you really don't need a vehicle, unless you're moving around with your dog or something like that. So what we like to say is, compare Uber to the next best alternative. How efficiently do we move people compared to other alternatives? And the baseline here is, driving yourself in your own personally owned sedan. Obviously, a pickup truck or an F-150 is worse. And walking yourself or riding a bike is as good as it gets. But there's a lot of things in the middle. Obviously, transit is much better, and it's the best sort of societal, sort of mass integration of opportunities to move people that doesn't include a personal vehicle. We fit somewhere in the middle. And we fit somewhere in the middle to the extent that we can get more than one person in the backseat of a car, right? Uber still, it depends on the use case. I think Dr. Martin framed it really well, that ride sharing can be a tool and a force for good, but the case studies, the use cases really do vary. There's a difference between people driving empty around from the Central Valley to serve more urban areas, or in its best case, it's an electric vehicle with 4 people in it moving around a city, right? So we have compounding factors that can interrelate, and the small tweaks and trends over time really do change what we think our actual congestion and sustainability footprint is. So I'll talk a little bit about human behavior relates to this, but also the insights of how pricing and just simple convenience changes behavior. People, obviously respond to price, but people also are generally lazy and like things that are really easy and accessible, and that changes how people, make decisions. With all that, pushback on sort of Uber and Lyft and all the other different international competitors, the pushback on our growth has really started really early. We still are a very small footprint of VMTs. As I mentioned, the boogeyman is the thing on the left where people are driving themselves around in their own personal vehicle. If you look at DMV or really any of the federal government databases about VMT travel and back end that into the stuff that we report to public agencies, we're still less than 2% of VMT in the roads. It's a little higher in a place like San Francisco. In some places, it's a lot higher if you're thinking about the downtown core of an urban area. We have a lot of research that I could point folks to that we've published on Medium about. There's a big difference between Uber and the absolute downtown core. If you think like Soma and Market Street in San Francisco or Manhattan in New York, and how that looks in just the immediate surrounding areas of like the suburban areas where people ingress and egress out of like what may be like their place of work. But still, the VMT proportionality is still very small. It's growing, and so we think that if we can show that it's a relatively better way of moving people around, then that growth, I think, fits into a lot of the public policies that we see, changing mobility over the course of the next 10 years. Again, lots of cars. Most of them sit still 95% of the time. That's not a good use of space or of the vehicles themselves. There's one person in it, and as Jen mentioned, it's eating up a lot of oil use and is a big reason why we're not reaching our environmental goals. So the principles that we approach this with are fewer, fuller, more efficient. And I'll tie some product and kind of conceptual ideas to each of those. But generally, the better those things get, the better our footprint is in terms of its impact on VMT and obviously how that translates or correlates with emissions. So just in 10 years, if you compare us to taxi, which we think we've kind of put behind us, it's no longer a real thing. In a lot of places, taxi, we just put taxi on our app. We don't need to compete with taxi. If there's taxis out there sitting around idle, why not just put them on our app and the person who's closest to them that needs to use that? It's not as prolific in most California cities, but if you go to Florida It's places on the East Coast, places in Germany. A lot of these places, it's going to be our main entry point into Japan, is just put the taxis on a ride-sharing app. It basically serves the same function. It just helps increase the utilization of those vehicles. But with that, the type of on-demand, use your smartphone connectivity has already increased what we call utilization of these vehicles by a factor of at least 10% in just 10 years. And so is this better than what we had 10 years ago? Has technology helped in that regard? I think that the data there is sort of speaks for itself. And then in general, just our platform itself has gotten better over time. So early days, Uber, cell phones weren't as good, but also the things weren't just kept as busy. If you went out and decided to drive, how often you have somebody in the vehicle or you're going to get somebody has been improved over time by a lot of factors. We have a product called Pool, which some of you may have experienced, and I'll show a slide on in a minute here. That obviously helps because there's less time in between. Sometimes you're stacking the passenger miles traveled on top of each other. But just in general, the efficiency of our platform has gotten better over time, which means more drivers means there's usually a driver closer to you, which means there's less time in which you have to order. Once you hail a vehicle, it's traveling to get you, and that kind of feeds itself. We have sort of what we call like a flywheel of efficiency, and that can apply to a lot of use cases. A few of my slides are messed up here because these are like animated, but you get the general concept here of Pool. If you see two people moving in the same direction, that happens a whole lot. Anytime you're stuck on the freeway, I like to tell people, look at all the cars next to you and look at all the empty seats. You could probably just, come to some financial arrangement with the guy and leave one car at home and you make a new friend. Still not something that's really culturally accepted in America, but something that I think is one of the easiest, most simplistic tools to try to get to this. Some of our economists like to say in the 70s, carpooling first kind of took off and then it just got abandoned completely. We're trying to bring it back and make it cool again, but still, many people do not want to, talk to their mom on the phone while they're sitting next to a stranger. But, we have a lot of data, particularly in California, to show, well, exactly how much cheaper do you need to make it for people to just be okay with that? And I think over time, that's where proving that we can do that and actually transition people to sharing vehicles is something that we need to work with the public sector on. So conceptually, we want to move people out of single occupancy vehicles to sharing a ride with strangers, or into higher occupancy vehicles or bus lines, or into bikes and scooters. So how do we do that? Putting it all in one place is proving to be a really, really good way of doing that. We like to call ourselves a mobility aggregator, which is one of the simplest ways to change people's decision of how am I going to go from A to B, is to let them compare it right next to each other. And so while this is still being integrated in different cities at different paces, in places like Denver, which I'll mention in a minute here, you can actually see if I'm going to go from the airport to the central business district, a car is going to cost me X amount of money and take me X amount of time. And so when transit truly is the better option, not just in terms of price, but in terms of it's going to get you there faster, even if people are not big transit advocates, people aren't that irrational to make a doubly bad decision for themselves. And so it is a way in which we actually do see mode shift, is simply putting it right in front of their face and giving them the optionality to do that. But still there's a convenience factor to it where, these are a little bit backwards, but it also includes the ability to purchase things in the app. So I go to San Francisco a lot from my home in Sacramento. That includes hailing an Uber to go to Amtrak, to buying an Amtrak ticket, to getting into the city, getting on the bus over the bridge, to getting another Uber to go into the office. Our vision is very, very soon here, say in the next 2 years, is to be able to just press one button and all that's arranged for you. So you don't have to go through the clunkiness of pull out your credit card and punch in your information. It is really all seamless in one place. And our hope is that people will respond to that by actually deciding to do that instead of driving themselves. The other big trend is, I mentioned transit, and I'll get to a little bit more of that, is the micromobility movement. So we purchased Jump in May of 2018. We had a big launch event here in Sacramento. Within 6 months, we started doing more Jump trips in downtown Sacramento than Uber trips, which is pretty incredible. It's the only place in the world that we've been doing that. But now that the weather's not scorching hot, if you go out on a weekend here, you see a lot of people taking Jump around, which is really exciting. But more importantly, as we spread this out, this slide got messed up. Again, it was animated, but it shows that in places like San Francisco, because we've put Jump onto the Uber app in one place, if you guys are Uber users, you've seen we're piling more and more things into one place, including food delivery and other ways of getting around. But it shows that people that use both Uber and Jump, once we've introduced Jump into the app, they're using Jump more and using Uber less. So it's actually cannibalizing our own business, and it's also happening during places and times when it's most congested. So what I mean by that is rush hour leaving San Francisco. A lot of people that are dual users are choosing to use Jump when we want people to get off the road the most, when it's the most congested. And secondly, then Uber kind of ticks back up during the late night hours. So it shows that it's actually having this complementarity that we're hoping that would actually have. And while that's still in its kind of infant stages, the data shows that it sticks and it translates into international markets as well. This is, again, a little bit moving backwards here, but this is what it looks like to actually have the ability to purchase a transit ticket in your app and use it in one place. So that just kind of streamlines the user experience. We have this currently in Denver. We're about to launch it with Caltrain in San Francisco. So it's really exciting to see this roll out. It's growing at like 55% week over week. So we're seeing more and more people deciding to use your Uber app to use transit, but also use a vehicle wherever that transit may stop. And here's a little bit more on what I just mentioned here. So why am I talking so much about transit? Transit's good for our business. If people are using transit more, it means they're not driving themselves. It means wherever the transit gets to, it's not often all the way at your front door. So we like to say that, you know, we can become the last mile, first mile of a transit, a multi-leg trip. And the more and more we have them doing that, obviously, on our app, that's good for business. We're not going to ever make money encouraging people to buy a transit ticket, but holistically over time, if more and more people are getting out of their car, that's obviously good for our growth, however you chop and skew it. So that's really exciting. Lowering overall costs, you know, the inefficiency of having to go through this whole buy a ticket operation that I've mentioned. By putting it in the app, you obviously can track this a lot easier. You can tie it back to your business expenses. It just encourages the user experience overall, and then it extends the reach of transit. And I've got a slide on that towards the tail end here. So brief commentary on what Jen was mentioning about SB 1014. This was a couple years ago, which first started as an idea that was really threatening to our business, which was force all the folks that drive a few times a week with the car that's in their garage to go buy an electric vehicle. And if they don't get to do it anymore. But we worked with the state legislatures, we worked with folks at CARB, and moved us into a direction we actually are very, very proud of where the policy landed, because it does capture and measure our business the way that we prefer, and the way that I think is actually accurate, which is how efficiently do we move people compared to other alternatives. And the metric there is impact per passenger mile, or your emissions per passenger mile. And so rather than it just being pure VMT is a factor of how many people are in the car as well. So again, electric vehicles are great. Electric vehicles with 3 people in it are proportionally better than somebody driving themselves around in their F-150, for example. And on the top line there, I won't go through every one, but those are just examples of a longer list of product things that are features within our Uber platform that correlate with all those different components of what goes into that formula. So we're really excited about measuring that, because it will show over time as we grow, are we getting better? Are we reducing our impact per passenger mile relative to other things that obviously either receive public investment or people perceive as sort of solutions to congestion and the climate change challenge. So I think January 1st, CARB is going to first publish sort of where our baseline is for 2018. It'll sort of be like the old like AB 32 baselines, I guess. I'm not an expert in this area, so shake your head if I'm wrong. But it will allow us to actually have some benchmarks that we want to track to over time. And it gives us a lot of tools to get there. It's not just pushing people into EVs, it's also encouraging people to take transit, encouraging people to share a ride. So all these things are tools in our toolbox of reducing this metric over time. And this is just a more wonky version of how CARB is translating our thinking here. So lastly, I mentioned a lot of these tools already, but vehicle greening is the way we're going to go about this. Changing people's behavior is the way we're going to go about this. Doing first mile, last mile partnerships is the way we're going to go about this. And then encouraging infrastructure transformation. So if you see places like in Sacramento, they're installing more bike lanes. That is good for, it's more conducive to this overall vision that I'm speaking about here. Also, there's analytics to this. Given the reference to SB 1014 and CARB's implementation of the Clean Mile Standard, is we can measure this really, really precisely in a way that most other modes of transport cannot. So we have, your cell phones are pretty precise. It's incredible to the extent to which we can measure exactly how much, our TNC vehicles are moving, how often you're actually taking a TNC and then getting onto a transit operation. So the level of specificity in which we can measure this transformation is actually something really exciting. And finding the right way to share that with cities and with policymakers is sort of the next frontier that we're excited about being a part of. And on top of that, the idea of road pricing or congestion pricing was mentioned. We're very supportive of the idea, because if you speak about this kind of idea of everybody has the optionality of looking at their phone and seeing all the ways of getting from A to B, whether that's having somebody in an Uber pick you up, taking a bike, taking transit, or some combination thereof. If you layer on a congestion pricing idea, it basically becomes a marketplace for efficiency. So what that looks like is all the, if transit is a little bit better in terms of price and convenience, and you layer on congestion pricing on top of that, it magnifies that differential in a way that will further even change behavior. And we think that Uber, Lyft, ride sharing, or these mobility platforms, if you want to adopt my terminology, will help take all the uncertainty that comes with the idea of implementing road pricing or congestion pricing, that I know policymakers all agree is a good idea, but there's huge political tide winds. We think we can help sort of bring it to life in a way that will actually encourage the rational behaviors we all hope it would translate to. Again, my slides are sort of out of order, I apologize, but just sort of a case study of how this looks. In London, this was a couple of years ago, they extended the night tube to later night operations, and we had a huge uptick in pickups from all the terminal stops that were extended to during that time. So it showed that because of ride sharing, it encouraged people to use transit during times in which they were hoping the added investment would encourage people to take those routes, because people knew I'm not going to get stranded, 2 miles from my house if I decide to take this all the way to the last stop, because there's the reliability that comes with ride sharing or bikes or whatever it may be. And lastly, I think the theme of sort of right-sizing public transportation was mentioned, is things like VIA. We have partnerships internationally in some U.S. markets where we sort of supplement a public transport operation. If there are existing bus lines that are not being well utilized, there's ways in which we can look at go and partner with a public transport agency and say, look, here's where you need a little bit less, less intensively, or less investment, that we can sort of supplement with a ride-sharing operation. And that's sort of the next frontier that we're looking at in terms of a business, is how do we help public transportation fill in the gaps where it's not working well, or where demand is more elastic than a bus line really is meant for. And that's it.
Okay, so Dr. Martin, one of the points you mentioned is that one of several optimistic points you mentioned is that the amount of emissions generated by electricity is going down. So what are the prospects for that continuing to go down in the future? And a related question, what really is what are the net emissions for a mile traveled in an electric vehicle versus a more conventional vehicle? Netted out.
So I mean, I'll start with the first question in terms of what is driving, as I mentioned in the talk, is really an expansion of renewable energy capacity, production capacity. That is primarily in the form of solar energy. So solar. I mean, I don't want to dismiss the other major sources, such as wind and biofuels and hydro, but the expansion of solar has been significant. Generally in the morning, in California, right now during the year, I mean, this changes during the year, but in the morning, from the hours of, say, like 7 a.m. to about 12 p.m., most electricity that we're consuming is from solar panels, and that's really extraordinary. I mean, that has been something that's really a transformation. So much so that we have now curtailment of those sources. So we're throwing some of that energy away or dialing it back because it's too much. We can't handle it all. There's sort of a minimum capacity or minimum production that we need from sort of the other resources that can't be turned off so easily. And so where is this going? Well, this actually speaks to the increased need for energy storage in the form of batteries, in the form of other forms of energy, and that can be in the form of electric vehicles. We have at some hours during the day too much renewable energy. So there definitely is room for that, for some of that energy, of course, to be thrown into vehicles, and then also into just sort of conventional battery storage systems, so that we can dial up these sources even more, use the energy at night where we do run out of renewable energy sources, and wind is, of course, intermittent at capacity. So there's a lot of potential for that, but we're actually, I mean, it's a great story. We're actually getting to the point where we need now to make some adjustments in terms of and I don't know if I can really give you an emissions difference off the top of my head, in part because this is changing so rapidly. The grid is becoming cleaner and cleaner really every year.
Thanks. So Dr. Gress, you indicated that, of course, there's reasons for optimism by way of technology, but behavior is going to be really important, and pricing is one of the best ways of changing behavior. What are some of the mechanisms by which we can alter pricing but also protect low-income people?
Well, one of the key things is simply, starting with an investment in alternatives to driving alone so that a low-income person doesn't have to drive. They don't have to use a priced road. They'll have an alternative. But to the extent those alternatives are not available, you can provide discounts, or you could provide targeted services to those groups that maybe do matching services for carpooling or other kind of special targeted services to reduce the impact and just provide additional options.
Okay, thanks. And then just one question for you, Austin Hayworth. What percentage of Uber rides actually have more than a single passenger? Because wouldn't that be critical to a lot of the arguments you're making?
So regarding pool, we're able to measure that. So in places like most of the San Francisco market, which includes about 12 counties, it's about 27% of trips are a pool trip. Yeah. That can include 2 or 3 people. It depends on the efficiency of when you can connect. It's actually something
that's got to vary from area to area.
Correct.
Yeah.
And again, in a place like Sacramento, I've actually spoken to Jen about this, is why don't we have pool here, at least for certain routes like coming from the airport. It's a certain sort of break point of at what point is there enough density to make it realistic. But then obviously when you take a regular Uber trip, you often bring friends, family, somebody else. And so we don't measure that now. There's privacy reasons and lots of complexity to why we do that. But obviously it's not one, right? So I think the metric that was landed on with CARB, based upon some survey data, is 1.4. We think is about how often, about the ratio of people in your traditional trip where we're not actually measuring how much connectivity there is. So it's better than just one, but obviously we want to increase that over time.
Right. So before we get to audience questions, were there any comments or questions that you wanted to put to each other?
I have a question. So the Clean Mile Standard, as I talked about, it's a groundbreaking regulation for us because we're going after TNCs. We've not done that before. They're in fleets. We see the future of transportation being increasingly in fleets. So as we're developing this regulation, we're thinking ahead to other types of fleets that maybe we can apply a similar kind of approach to, and delivery fleets is one of those. And so you talked about the difficulty in, the data you presented made it look like, at least right now, VMT isn't really increasing with delivery fleets. And so it made me think, should CARB not be thinking about delivery fleets as a kind of as a future regulation? And how do you get at some of the measurement issues you brought up regarding, consumers' offsetted trips to the mall? So what are your thoughts on that?
I think it is a very difficult measurement problem, and I wouldn't, I'm not going to suggest that you do or not do that policy. I mean, there's certainly an increase in VMT that we're observing in the trips. The way that we think about this is sort of how, what is that substituting for? So it's actually a more challenging problem than, say, for passenger markets, for passengers, because there's that direct trip that you can see. But now you've got a tour of vehicles, or a vehicle that's conducting a tour and servicing multiple households. And how many of those would have been trips that would have been offset? That is a completely different problem, and sort of the ability of course, trucks to carry just that additional package or sort of the additional freight is a far more complex problem that's very, very challenging to measure.
I would just add briefly that we do invite some view of it, because commercial delivery, your Amazon truck with 30 Christmas presents in it is different than this new growth in on-demand delivery. We have, a food delivery product, grocery delivery product. In certain places of the country, we'll go and, run to CVS for medicine at midnight. But while that's much smaller in proportionality to our overall rides business, it is growing faster than that. And so, I mentioned the tension of getting somebody to share the backseat with a stranger. There's equal environmental and congestion benefits of layering those things on. So I mentioned we're building sort of a super app where all these things integrate. Imagine if you were getting a ride home from the airport and you could save $5 if you picked up somebody's Thai food or pizza on the way. So there's ways to layer these things together in a way where a pool trip isn't just mean another person. It can mean a lot of things. We're testing with the federal government, the military, actually, ability for drones to drop things on top of moving passenger vehicles. So imagine if you could save money and have a cheaper Uber trip, and the driver can earn more money. It's doubly good for our business if you layer on the productivity of every mile on the road. So you could be driving down the 5 from the airport, and there's an Amazon delivery center right there. You could drop an Amazon thing right on top of a little box on top of your car as it's moving along. So we view that as, there's tons of things you can layer on with efficiency with data that is not just putting 2 people in a car. So, yeah.
Thanks. I just want to say, this is why I like participating with Austin on these panels, because he always turns like regulatory measures into like business opportunities. And so
All right, well, I think we've come to the end of our time, but thank you very much to our 3 panelists.